committees. Those of you who have been on these are probably a little tired of hearing my broken record pitch at the beginning, but I'm going to go through it anyway, in part because we are also streaming live on YouTube, and these meetings are archived on YouTube for folks to watch at any time. Just a few administrative items. We will have an opportunity for members of the public who would like to speak to this subcommittee in the last 15, 20 minutes of the call. If you would like to speak to this subcommittee, I would just ask that you drop a note in the chat to either Carrie or myself. And on the note of the chat, we do ask everyone to refrain from using the chat. It can be distracting for all members, and particularly those who are using a screen reader or other adaptive technologies. So we try to avoid using the chat altogether, other than if there is an urgent matter you need to flag to Carrie or me, or you're a member of the public who would like to speak. Other than that, I think we may have some members of the public listening from time to time. We do ask that if you are a member of the subcommittee, or certainly one of our panelists, that if you're in a place that it is safe and comfortable to do so, you have your camera on so everyone can connect with you. I understand some people may be driving, and we would encourage you not to have your camera on during those times. The only other administrative item I will flag is we do ask that when you speak, the first time you give a full introduction of yourself, and anytime you speak, you simply just introduce yourself at least by first name so folks know who is speaking. With that, because we've got a great panel of a half a dozen people, we also have the privilege of welcoming a new member to this subcommittee. So I'm going to start off by asking our members to introduce themselves, and I will go first to Anais and then to Shelley.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anais, and I am a youth and adult advocate with the ARC in Larimer County.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shelley Marquez. I'm the president of Mercy Housing Mountain Plains. We provide affordable housing across the state of Colorado. Good to be here with you today.
Thanks, Shelley. Let me go to Cassidy and then Rochelle.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cassidy Roberts. I'm an attorney at Disability Law Colorado. We're the state's protection and advocacy system, and I do our housing work.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Rochelle Mitchell. I'm the CEO for Connections for Independent Living, as well as the chair for the Association of Colorado Centers for Independent Living.
Thank you, Paul. And then David, I'll have you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Paul Brady, an architect and owner at God & Civic Architects in Centennial.
And David Bolin is a new member joining us for our first subcommittee meeting today after one of our other members had to step aside. David, excited to have you. If you could give folks just a little bit of your background.
Sure. David Bolin. I'm now retired, but I spent over 30 years working with people with disabilities at Centers for Independent Living, as well as a couple of home health agencies. And at one of those centers, we did a tremendous amount of work working with Thistle Community Housing, Boulder Housing Partners, and helping to develop affordable and accessible housing.
Great. Thanks, David. Karen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Kallenberg. I'm the executive director for our state organization of Habitat for Humanity. We build for sale affordable housing across the state in 45 communities.
Thank you, Karen. And for those who are new to this conversation today, this task force, the 1296 task force, named after the House bill, or the Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities, is structured as 4 subcommittees. This subcommittee looking at housing. We have another one looking at a rewrite of Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act, or CADA. We have one looking at outdoor recreation, and we have one looking at a wide span of government services, things like running for and serving in office, working for government, or participating in government. Each subcommittee is independently comprised of members who were selected by the governor's office. We also have an umbrella or an executive committee task force, and we have one of the members of the executive committee on, and it's always a pleasure to have Michael Stone. Michael, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Barrick. Michael Stone speaking. Hello, everybody. First and foremost, thank you so much for your time and effort into all that you're doing. We have the privilege of learning all that you share, and hopefully working together to apply the sum of all things good.
Thank you, Michael. With that, I'm going to go right into our panel in just 1 minute. Just a preview for everyone on the call what to expect today. We are going to spend the majority of our time with our panelists. They bring a really rich diversity of lived experience, of professional background. So I want to spend as much time with them as possible. I'll be asking each of them to introduce themselves and give a 1 or 2 minute background on the type of work they do, but also their entry point into this conversation. I will ask a few probing questions for them to get things going, but then I really want to open it up to the members of the subcommittee to ask questions. At the end of today's call, I do need to hold time if we do have folks from the public who want to address the subcommittee, and we have a few administrative items to cover, and I'll just preview those right now. Carrie has sent around to members some surveys about getting some extra meetings and the potential of a longer possible in-person session. So I want to make sure that everybody got those and we follow up on that. Otherwise, we're going to spend our time with all of you getting to hear from our panelists. And panelists, I know most of you have spoken with either Carrie or myself. Just to ground everyone, this subcommittee has really 3 charges. One is to examine what is the current need, demand, and inventory of accessible housing. What is the projected future need a decade from now? And what are some recommendations we may want to develop to address things like the financing, affordability, and access of accessible housing? And we've had discussions in this group about how broad that phrase itself is when we say accessible housing, that a lot of folks jump to mobility disabilities and making sure we have doors and ramps, but there is so much more, whether we're talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, or we're talking about the communities where things are located. So we're charged with making recommendations across that broad set of issues. Carrie, I'm going to ask you, as I just bring in our panelists by first name, to start spotlighting them. Folks, very transparent. It's a little bit of a behind the scenes activity that has to go on here. But let's get Elena spotlighted, as well as Tim. And I'm just going to keep adding folks here. We also have Louisa, Ali, Hunter, and Carrot. And as we get everyone here spotlighted, I'm going to start asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Elena, while we're getting everyone up here, if I could get you to start with just, who are you? What's your background, your connection to this, and where do you come into today's conversation?
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today. My name is Elena Stevenson, and a little bit about my background. I started out in interior architecture in terms of thinking about housing and my design work. So I have a master's in interior architecture and design, but got really interested in conducting research about human well-being and being able to test and study environments to make sure that the designs that we're making can support well-being for all people. I recently completed my doctoral studies at Cornell University, where I looked at soft robotic surfaces for soothing emotion regulation purposes. And I'm a new convert. I've just moved to Colorado in last August. I guess I can't say I'm not new anymore. I'm a new assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I'm launching a research lab called the NeuroD Lab, where we investigate products, technologies, and systems exploring through the lens of neurodiversity and neurodivergent experiences, looking at how we can design products that are really about joy and fulfillment, and less about one of my slogans is more fidgets and less fixes, and kind of pushing back on some of the interventionist themes that happen in my work. I do a lot of work in interaction design and environmental psychology, where there's a lot of a trend to try to force neurodivergent people into behaving more neurotypical, and that many of the designs we're putting out into the world, that's their main aim. And so I try to push back on that a little bit and have participatory design practices for a neurodiverse community that supports us all in environments, technologies, and spaces. So I'm rambling, and there's so many amazing people here today that I'm so excited to hear from. So thanks for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Elena. Welcome a little belatedly to Colorado,
Yes.
and welcome to this panel. Tim, would love for you to introduce yourself and make sure people understand your background with the state and with some other agencies and where you connect to this big conversation.
Sure. Thanks. And hello, everybody. And thank you for having me today. My name is Tim Dolan. And I come at this from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, I'm the father of an 18-year-old son on the autism spectrum. So I have I bring some lived experience through my son. But from a housing standpoint, I was at the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority for 18 years. Financing multifamily, affordable multifamily development, and was briefly for about a year, or a little less than a year, I guess, was with the Colorado Division of Housing before I sort of struck out on my own with some consulting. And primarily what I do with regard to the consulting is head up an organization called the Inclusive Housing Coalition, which is a Colorado nonprofit that was formed for the purpose of increasing housing in Colorado for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we do that through a number of ways. First of all, we we try to bridge knowledge gaps between the affordable housing community, the service provision community, and the IDD community at large, the people with lived experience as well as parents and caregivers. And so that's what I bring. That's the perspective that I bring. And so I'm hoping to be able to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Let me go to Karen and then Hunter.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Karen Zeed and I wear many hats. I do have a 21-year-old on the spectrum that also has some PTSD trauma. My kids are adopted from China. And my husband and I are in our 60s, so we fit that category of, oh my God, what are we going to do when we can't care for our kids? So a lot of my drive comes from that. I don't have family here. We're pretty scattered. Systems are complicated. Community is difficult to connect to. So I've really, for the last 8 years, have been digging into what's going on across the country. And I've gone to different developments in different parts of the country to see what they're doing. I've seen things that are grandfathered in, and then there's things that, we can and cannot do. So I kind of I know enough to get myself in trouble in that category. I also I've been on the ACL board for Boulder and Broomfield counties. ACL is the local chapter of ARC. And this is my 6th year on the board. And 2 years ago, we started a ACL Inclusive Housing Network. And our goal there, and what we've been trying to really achieve, is to educate Boulder and Broomfield, all the people who make the decisions, really trying to get in front of everybody with data, statistics. Open your eyes. These people are coming down your pipeline. Lord knows where they're going to live and how they're going to live. Really trying to bring awareness to decision makers. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Karen. Let's go to Hunter and then Louisa, and then we're Allie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hunter. I am the Kelsey's policy manager. I'm based in Bellingham, Washington, but I lived in Wyoming for almost a decade, so very familiar with the Mountain West. Love the state so much. And so at the Kelsey, we are an organization that's co-led by people with and without disabilities. I also identify as disabled, multiple invisible disabilities. And we have a unique model. We have a dual mission where we both build housing on the ground. We have 2 developments, one that just opened actually this last week in San Jose, and then one in San Francisco is going to open later next year. And we also, advance policies at the state, federal, and local level to make our housing model, disability forward housing that is affordable, accessible, integrated, and inclusive, really the norm across the country. And so in the past year and a half, I've developed a lot of technical expertise on the low-income housing tax credit program, and we're really looking at doing a lot more state-level advocacy around that. I know that this committee talked a little bit about qualified allocation plans last time you all met. And so definitely excited to dig into that opportunity more, because I think that it's really an untapped space for really increasing the supply of the housing that people desperately need.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hunter. Let's go to Louisa and then Allie.
Hi there. Thank you everyone for having us. I'm team member 2 on the Kelsey that's here. Allie is going to complete our trio. My role at the Kelsey is on the housing team. So I work actively managing our housing developments, the 2 that Hunter mentioned in California, and then also doing technical assistance projects for clients across the country who are often local governments as well as private citizens. So currently we're doing a project with the city of Denver on understanding the barriers and opportunities for housing people with IDD. So that's specifically focusing on housing supply. So working with landlords, property managers, and trying to understand where the levers we can pull, what we can do on a policy side to try and remove some of those barriers to get more people into housing.
Lisa, Allie, floor is yours.
Okay, to finish off the trio, I'm Allie. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado. I just moved here about a year and a half ago. I come to this work as also a disabled person who's been involved in the disability rights movement, starting with my local independent living center over, 15 years ago. And been really grateful to come to the Kelsey 4.5 years ago. And I'm the director of advocacy here and work closely with Hunter and Louisa and the rest of our team, and really ensuring that we have a feedback loop across our technical assistance, our actual on the ground development as a co-developer, and then our policy and advocacy work, whether that be through regulatory means or legislatively. I will also share that the Kelsey really functions not just as a co-led organization for co-led by people with and without disabilities. We look at disability forward housing. That's the term we use. And when we think about creating a future where everyone with and without disabilities can thrive in their own homes, we look at the solutions overall in what we call a cross disability lens. So not just focusing on any one diagnosis. Sometimes we do have specific projects that focus in on subgroups of the large disabled population, but we really look at policy solutions and then our housing on the ground to ensure that people with disabilities of all different backgrounds and identities can live and thrive. And I'll just finish with saying that we do, though, in our housing model and in our policy change efforts, we do make sure to center people with disabilities who are extremely low and low income, who need some type of support, whether it's 4 hours a week to 24 hours a day in their own homes to thrive. And we believe that we need housing and service systems to be linked, separate but linked, to make people's be able to live out their right to community living. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Allie. And yes, we have a full lineup generally and from the Kelsey. A few of you on this subcommittee and some members of the task force exec committee said, make sure we learn from the Kelsey. And Carrie took that request very seriously, as you see. So we appreciate all of you joining. Just to set some expectations here, I'm going to really ask 2 priming questions, and I'll tell you what they are, and then I'm going to read the charge of this group to give you all a moment to think about it. My questions for the group are going to be around things in your experience that you found most people aren't considering or addressing when it comes to developing accessible and affordable housing. What are the things that this group really needs to be considering that you haven't seen be front of mind? And then I'm going to ask you about some innovative approaches, however big or small you've seen in other places or in smaller scale, even here in Colorado, that you think we want to look at scaling. Just to again ground us in what this subcommittee is doing, I'm going to be looking over at another screen so I read it exactly. The purpose of this subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure, affordable, accessible, and attainable housing for persons with disabilities. The deliverable that we're required to submit is a report later this year with recommendations outlining the current need for an inventory of accessible housing in Colorado, the projected increased need for accessible housing in the next decade, and recommendations to meet future housing demand, including the financing for low-income housing development and other associated regulations or statutory changes. So with that kind of background and all of your particular personal and professional background, Tim, I'm going to go to you first. And I'm curious to hear from you, what's something in your work as a parent with the Division of Housing and with CHAPA that some people you found weren't aware of that needed to be considered or just highlighted?
Sure. And I, you know, and as far as not considering it, I count myself in that group for, you know, a really long time. And that really has to do with, you know, we come at it, our work from the perspective of intellectual and developmental disabilities. And oftentimes, those are invisible disabilities that people don't necessarily see. And so it's not considered because it's not as open in the front as it might be with a physical disability. And so in my work, I have seen, you know, in the affordable housing community writ large, I see, you know, great intention for many different types of housing for many different people. The housing for specifically for intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's not that it hasn't necessarily been considered, it just hasn't been a focus. And it needs to be a focus because there's a large segment of the population that is not being served with appropriate housing. Right, housing where they're going to thrive. And that doesn't necessarily just mean the roof over their head. That means a setting in which they're going to be able to be part of the community. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities struggle with, including my son, struggle with anxiety and you know, social issues, which makes it difficult for them to interact with their community, which then can exacerbate isolation and loneliness. And so it's important, you know, it's important to create a community that is going to help those folks. Now, what I've learned over time is that, you know, the IDD housing, the IDD community is a lot more extensive and intensive than I probably ever thought it was going to be, because I just look at it from the perspective of my son, who happens to be fairly high functioning. So I think that to answer, so just to kind of go back to your question, Barrick, I think that there hasn't been those connections, those linkages between the affordable housing community, the service provision community, and the IDD community. They haven't been strong enough to be able to focus on IDD housing. That's just, you know, that's just the informational part of it, let alone the financing part of it, service provision part of it, in the just the general lack of affordable housing in Colorado for everybody of lower income. So that's what I see.
Thank you, Tim. And I could probably ask you a dozen follow-up questions, but I'm going to hold and let our members ask those. I'm going to try to give people a heads up so you can be thinking about this. I'm going to go next to Allie and then to Karen. And Allie, same question to you and wherever you want to go with it. But when you think about this broad charge we have of looking at the current inventory and demand, the future projected need, and ensuring Colorado has the inventory to meet all of the need for accessible housing, what is something that you've seen fall off the radar or not be given the attention or the consideration or awareness as somebody takes on that broad of a charge?
Such a question. I'll speak to two of the many pieces. So one, I would say who is at the table and who has a role in decision making. We need this, whatever solutions are presented forward to the state that you all spearhead, we have to center and listen to the needs of those most impacted by the crisis and people with disabilities. I'm just even looking at our panel here, you know, majority of us, you know, there's a lot of voices that aren't being heard today, right? Not just disability wise, but racially, citizenship status, experiences in, you know, housing instability and institutionalization, et cetera. So I would really first start with how are we supporting leaders with all different types of disabilities? And I want to challenge, you know, there's often assumptions that like certain types of people with disabilities may not normatively be at the table. And I just want to challenge, like, there are so many ways to center like accessible communication and bringing folks to really, yeah, spearhead what they need and what they want in their lives. So the second piece is, I think the disability rights movement, which I love deeply. Before coming to the Kelsey, my experience was that we didn't really, as a disability rights movement, have a strong backbone in housing policy. And if we did have a backbone, it was on like litigation, which thank goodness we need it, and the need to increase requirements, whether that be, you know, accessible requirements or quote unquote set-asides or what have you. All of that's really important. And what I've learned, whether I like it or not, is that the housing market is driven by incentive. It's driven by who, you know, how will this development be as competitive as possible for funding? And because disability access and inclusion has always just been thought of as a requirement, thing like, and a piece of compliance, which again, we need, it has set a precedence that disability is only seen as something to comply to versus something that actually makes a project better. And so I'd really consider what are incentives that we can embed across the housing market here in Colorado to make the nature of disability forward housing have a greater appetite by the market, both affordable and market rate. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ali, for both of those points. And I want to just pause there. And I want to invite you and every member of this panel and any public watching to hold our feet to the fire in making sure we have all of the voices at the table. We're also, my next point is I want you to hold us accountable, and I'm going to ask you to help us. This summer, as this group starts to put ideas on paper, we want to stakehold them. We want to make sure we're getting all perspectives. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask all of you, and we will follow up with all of you as those ideas are shared on the DORA website. We would love your help getting those out to make sure we're getting all voices. So appreciate both of those points. Karen, let me go to you and then to Hunter on this question of what is not discussed at the table enough, in your opinion, or just not known in some of the conversations and in your lived experience?
Well, I'm going to start with urgency, because when you look at the numbers, if you take the 20,000 people with a disability that lives with an adult 60 or older, 20,000, okay? Tim can send you his presentation to show you the numbers. If the special needs, the IDD community got 40 units in each development, we'd need 500 developments. You cannot build fast enough to help the parents that are out there that have no idea what we're going to do with their kids. Systems are complicated. I can't move to another state because I'd have to reapply. Who's going to cover for my daughter? I mean, there's so much to put into that one piece. The other piece that we're not hooking the links together. Okay, you're going to build a house out there. Great. If I put my kid in a house, she'd be on her phone all day. You know, is she eating healthy? No. She likes noodles, and that's what she knows how to make. Okay, Costco's our friend. We put in the microwave for 3 minutes. Okay, so food and shelter, great. Okay, now what is she doing? Who's telling her to brush her teeth? Who's giving her meds? Who is telling her it's time to get dressed and let's go? Who's organizing her schedule? This is complicated. This is not something I can hand over to my niece and nephew who live in California and say, here, can you take care of her? Where is the human connection? Human connection is a lot, right? How many people are lonely out there? They're lonely because they don't know where to go. They don't know where to find the information, right? So we need to build communities with intention, you know, intention of connection, community spaces, you know, concierge services. You can go to the Kelsey book and probably find quite a few of them. But it's a big issue. It's not just a house, guys. It's not. My kid's going to get lost. The other piece of the pie is that there's a spectrum of need. There are homes being built that we're getting units for the IDD community. Great. My kid can't live there. That's not enough for her. So there's a spectrum of need, and you really got to start focusing a bit on that need that sits over here. You know, those 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", all of those folks who really, really, really need help. None of us want an institution, you know, but look at what seniors do. Seniors move into a senior community. They can go down and have lunch. They've got people they can sit in a lobby with. They can come and listen to the book tour person. You know, we need to build, that's what they need at the age of 18. So I'm going to leave you there because you can see I have passion. I'm from New York. I apologize. I speak quickly.
No apologies. We appreciate both the passion and the thinking. And so, you know, this group has had a number of conversations about the importance of wraparound services and appreciate you highlighting that. Let me go to Hunter and then Elena and then to Louisa on the same question of what have you seen in your work was not highlighted enough or not considered or people weren't aware that we really need to make sure is an integral part of our exploration of how to meet the need statewide.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Karen is absolutely right that we need better service coordination. And I do think that a way to do that is to really look at, you know, the LIHTC program, the low income housing tax credit, the qualified allocation plan. Currently, as it is in Colorado, doesn't have any kind of incentives around increased service coordination. Right now, there's just, you know, a set aside. So there's an incentive to set aside at least 25% of units for people with disabilities, but that doesn't include, you know, the service that needs to go along with it. You know, the home and community-based settings rule, you know, it doesn't have any kind of incentives around making sure that people who do need support all the way up to 24 hours of support are able to live in those communities, live in those homes. And so that's definitely something that not a lot of states have really looked into adding to their QAP, but I do think that it's definitely an option that people should be exploring. And then it really does come down to just making sure that those units are also being marketed as well to people with disabilities, because we hear kind of over and over again that they just couldn't fill the units. And we know that that's absolutely not true, because a lot of people with disabilities are coming to us like, we have no place to live. We need to find more units. And so it's about making sure that they have a better marketing plan. They communicate with service coordinators like centers of independent living to really understand the needs and make sure that they're look at their wait list and make sure that the matching people are matched to the units that really suit their needs. And then also just making sure that there's requirements around accessible design. Colorado doesn't have any requirements to make sure that the units are either accessible or adaptable. I really think Illinois actually has kind of the gold standard around this. They require that at least 10% of the total units in a low-income housing tax credit project are designed for persons with mobility impairments, and that at least 20% of the units are have requirements for adaptable dwelling units. So that means that any one of those units could be converted to an accessible unit, basically with little technical knowledge and like a screwdriver. And so that also means that, you know, individuals that are just coming to visit them who have disabilities don't have issues, you know, moving around the unit. And so that's kind of what we're really focused on at the Kelsey right now, is just making sure that this program works for people with disabilities, because you know, we've heard over and over again that it doesn't currently. It needs a lot of reforms, but this is definitely one that needs to be looked at the most, is making a requirement around accessible design.
Thank you. I love that we're already surfacing so many actionable ideas. Elena and then Louisa, the same question to both of you. What's not on the radar of enough folks frequently enough or prevalently enough?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll speak from my experience as a late diagnosed, high masking autistic ADHDer, and also somebody who has a late uncle with intellectual disabilities who was constantly in kind of this liminal space of not having enough of a disability to be able to get support services that were sufficient to help him live the life that he wanted to live, but kind of not having high enough support needs in other areas. So kind of when you're in between, you sometimes get pushed out from both sides. So I think that's one thing to really consider, is one, that we treat people's disabilities as if they're static experiences, which often they're not. Somebody might be really sensory sensitive in one moment and then be sensory seeking in another. And when we talk about these things, we're often acting as if somebody's experience in one environment will be their same in another environment. So I think thinking about people as less static and understanding how diverse, even within a single individual who might be dealing with a neurodevelopmental or intellectual disability, that might be. I guess to bridge upon that, I think thinking about how the sensory environment is affecting all of us is something that we're paying a lot more attention to now in conversation, but we're still not really understanding the very complex way that spending 90% of our time indoors is having upon us, and subtle things like blue light. You know, they just put out the best requirements for the lighting, which they want for sustainability purposes to be using a specific type of lighting because it uses less energy, and yet it has all of these negative psychological experiences for the humans who are existing in those spaces. So I think we really need to look intersectionally at a lot of the things that we're talking about with housing. Where is sustainability fighting up against what people with disabilities and just all people to have supportive environments might need? And there are some really simple things that we can kind of think about, you know, not having pattern carpet that has lots of linear elements that can cause people to feel dizzy and not know how to want to go into an area because it feels so scary. I personally get migraines triggered by something like that. And there's so many comorbidities when we're talking about a cognitive realm. So the other thing that I just think is important is that technology is not going to come in and save us and fix all of these problems for us. And I hear that a lot in all design realms, that like, well, maybe if we just add this like AI feature, that's going to maybe fix everything. And we need the human connection. It's so nice to hear what everyone before me has said about the complexity of this issue and the way that the services have to be operating, and that there isn't one single product, object, or technology that we can put in a home and suddenly kind of account for human needs. And I guess one minor point too is when we do make design decisions, just like when we need to publicize the housing that's available, a lot of the times we're adding things into homes that we don't actually explain to people how to use them. And so when we start adding these technologies and these assistive technologies in homes, we also need to give the information so that people know they're there and that they know how to use them. For example, I had like lights that were dimmable. And for me, lighting is like, as a migraine user and as an autistic person, is like an extremely important thing to my daily happiness. And my lights were dimmable for the 5 years I lived there, but I had no idea because I had to download an app and nobody had ever told me. So I just want to think about that, like, as we start adding all of these design things, how do we communicate about them? How do we make sure that we know about them and teach ourselves how to use them and each other how to use them? So, okay, ramble over. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I love it. Louisa, to you, what is not prominently enough on radars when you see these discussions taking place?
Yeah, I want to first just pause and say, like, thank you to everyone who's gone already. Like, there's been so many different approaches to this question and so many different elements. And I agree with everything that's been said so far. I come back from this as an affordable houser, so as somebody who has worked in affordable housing and know that background. And one thing I'll say is that, first of all, affordable housing often covers a certain range of affordability. Often people with disabilities fall below that range, and so it's a pretty large gap. And so when you see a lot of affordable housing, it goes down to 30% AMI. People on SSI cannot afford that. So there's actually, like, our affordable housing systems work in specific ways with specific funding streams, and those often do not cover this population. And so that's a huge gap right there, is how do we make sure that we extend the funding streams to cover the population when we know what their income is, because we know what benefits they are getting. So we are very acutely aware that people on SSI make a certain amount of money, and yet we are building affordable housing that they cannot afford. Another thing that's come up a couple times is just the flexibility and adaptability. And this is something we've seen in our research with the city of Denver over the last few months, is that individuals are different, access needs are different. One solution actually cannot fit everybody. There's no such thing as universal design. So whatever solutions that we think of and whatever things we're putting into place, it has to be adaptable to individual people's needs. And that's where something like an inclusion concierge, which Robin mentioned, which we have at our projects with Kelsey, someone whose job it is to be that adaptable interface to make sure that each person in our developments has access to the services they need as an individual, to make sure that whatever we design our units for, each individual who lives in that specific unit has that unit adapted to their needs. We need to constantly be thinking of how to create flexibility, because people are different and their needs are different. And especially people, and that's true of all people, but especially people with disabilities. So not trying to find a solution, but trying to find adaptable and flexible solutions.
Thank you, Louisa. I'll tell you, Louisa and Elena, you kind of teed it up perfectly for me to go into my part two question. I'm also seeing a ton of smiles and nods and a lot of people scrambling to write down notes as you all are talking, so that what you're saying is connecting with the members if you can't see them. I'm going to ask one more question and go around, and then I want to get our subcommittee in. Elena, you mentioned that AI and tech are not going to solve this. Louisa, you talked about the concierge as one example. I will, in full transparency, say when we started this work last year, I asked ChatGPT. I said, what have other states done to make material progress on solving this? I got 800 words of nothing back from ChatGPT. So I am grateful that we have all of you. Ali, I want to go to you first. I'll go to Ali and then Karen, and I would love to hear from each member. What is something, however small or big, you have seen done by a city, by a nonprofit, by a state, by someone somewhere that has made a meaningful difference in expanding access to accessible housing for people with disabilities?
Okay, well, I'll give one example. So, in my role at the Kelsey, just for context, I co-chair what we call a housing task force for the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities. And it's the largest cross-disability national policy coalition. And so we regularly are advising HUD and Congress on all of these issues. And one of the things that we have identified, and thankfully HUD has made some improvements on, is so there's the housing. So my prompt is like, what programs do we already have, and are we using them? are the people who are aimed to serve actually accessing the programs? And the answer is not sufficiently. So under the large housing choice voucher program, also known as Section 8, there's a particular program called the mainstream housing voucher, which is specifically geared towards extremely low and low income adults with disabilities. Many of you probably know about this program. And it's particularly also for folks who need supportive services in their own homes. And so one of the solutions that HUD has given guidance on that then local public housing authorities can implement is reducing administrative burdens on the end user. So there is an underutilization of mainstream housing vouchers. So that means that there are literally vouchers sitting there that could be going to Coloradans with disabilities, but they're not accessing them. Not because of the need isn't there, but because there's ineffective referral systems. For example, a lot of the referrals for housing choice vouchers majority of them are done through the continuum of care, which is really important. That's a huge, important source of people experiencing homelessness. And we want people who fall outside of the continuum of care to also be able to access those vouchers, especially folks who are at risk of institutionalization. And so public housing authorities can implement flexibilities, preferences on how mainstream vouchers can be paired. And then they can also provide administrative funds to ensuring that voucher is used. So for example, if the voucher, as we know, the accessible housing stock is horrible here. So if there needs to be, if the voucher needs to cover more of the rent because only accessible housing is in a given area, then the public housing authority has the ability to make those types of flexibilities, covering first month's rent. There are some things that are happening at the federal level that can be implemented across the state of Colorado. And I know for a fact that there are at least like a few hundred vouchers, mainstream vouchers that are just sitting there that could be helping people right now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Allie. Karen, I'm going to go to you and then to Louisa. However big or small, are there things you've seen that have made a difference either for an individual in seeking housing or at the system level that we may want to consider scaling or learning more about?
So I can't think of the name of the development, but I could probably look in my archives to find it. But in New Jersey, they teamed up with a sports team. And that sports team helped sponsor the building of a development for the IDD community. And again, I don't remember the who and the what, but I will go back and check. And we live in a wealthy community. We can't afford the rents, most of us, right? So there's a reason for that. There's a lot of money out there. So I think think of the way Children's Hospital does it. You know, if we took Children's Hospital concept and expanded it to the special needs community and really marketed this issue, we could probably raise a lot of money. But there is another one. I went to Kansas and went to see a place called CLO. They've since changed their name. I went with the gentleman from Imagine. And what they do, it is a technology piece, but it is a way to conserve dollars. It's not the answer for everything, but it's a snippet of the piece of the pie based on people's individual needs for runners, for whatever the need is. There are individuals that will benefit from having someone be able to turn their stove off from a distance. And what CLO has done is they have apartments throughout the community at large, but also within one community. And they have someone who lives like 3 people who live on site. But there's one person 24/7 that sits in a room with a mass thing of monitors. And they are able to provide medicine. We watched a girl take medicine. She pushed a buzzer. She said, "I'm ready to take my meds now." And the guy spoke back to her and there was a camera. And okay, I'm opening the box for you. And from a distance, someone opened up a medicine box and they were able to take their medicine. And they had to take the medicine in front of the camera. And that's just one example. They can close windows. They could, there's safety measures that I think come. And I think one of the important pieces of that, it gives you a little force of economics there. But also, it's important that the structure is built into the buildings you're going to build so that the infrastructure is there for those who need it. So those are my 2 that came to the top of my head.
Thank you. Let me go to Louisa and then up to Tim.
I think a key component is that we have these kind of 2 separate systems of housing and services. And this sort of housing thinks about housing and services thinks about services. And when it comes to people with disabilities, they have to be connected and they have to be interwoven. And so places where they can be connected, the more places of connection there, the more likely you'll have success in actually supporting people in their homes. And I'm going to keep harping on funding because that's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. But there isn't funding streams to during operational phases of housing to provide for literally the people to make sure those connections are happening. So kind of shifting our idea of what housing means, and housing not just being a unit, which might have a roll-in shower or, no cabinet under the sink, but also being a community that's supporting people in their needs to be able to live in that housing. And that those needs aren't just the design of the unit, it's the design of how they're accessing their systems, how they connect to the people they need to help them with their world, and everything from making sure service providers have a place to park in a building so they can get to their clients, to having a place to meet on site. So sort of really thinking about those connections to services and how that's a pivotal part of allowing someone to actually live in that house. It's not just the physical design, it's the design of the systems and how the systems are supporting them in their community.
Thanks, Louisa. Tim, I will let you pick from anywhere in your professional life, whether it was at housing or CHAFA or other things you've seen. What's something that has worked well that could be scaled, built upon, and whether that's Colorado or elsewhere, what can we look to as a way to address this challenge here?
Sure. I forgive me, Varric, but I'm going to give you something that's a little less concrete and a little bit more high level. And that's what I have seen, what I am most encouraged by in the past, call it a year, is buy-in. And I've seen buy-in from at least 4 different metro area local housing authorities. And that buy-in, I think, comes in through knowledge. What I'm finding out is that when decision makers, financiers, housing authorities, when they get to learn about the challenges and where they can be a part of solving these challenges comes in, and they can be a part of building accessible housing, they're in. Now, the challenge is where do you find the resources to be able to do that? Now, to Hunter's point with regard to the QAP, absolutely. All day long, I think that they should be revamping the QAP, but I see it as very much of a yes and, right? It's the QAP and there's so many other need for resources. I'm encouraged by things like Proposition 123 that brings other equity resources linked to other state funding sources. And I think that those are very encouraging. But to change something like the QAP, you really need the buy-in from the local level, because the QAP is, that's in CHAFA's world, and there is a tax credit. There's a tax credit committee that made up of various affordable housing people throughout the state that have a lot of input into that. So I think that when you have this buy-in, like I said, at the local level from policymakers, from housers, And once they find out that, this is something that they can work on, that's the thing that I find most encouraging, because it really resonates with the folks that really want to work on this.
I appreciate you going a totally different direction than where I tried to push you, and I think it's gonna be helpful for the conversation. Let me go to Hunter and then Elena.
Yeah, definitely understand how complicated it is to get changes into the QAP. I think it does kind of take, a variety of advocates getting involved. I think most of the comments that those tax credit allocation agencies get are from developers, or from housing providers, and they don't necessarily hear a lot of comments from, people with lived experience with disabilities, or even, grassroots organizations. And so that's something that we're trying to definitely get involved in Colorado is figure out who kind of are the key players in the area, who's interested in making sure that we have more of these units available. And then also I a little shameless plug again for our design standards. Actually, the city of San Jose and the city of District Columbia, they have their own qualified allocation plan, that has a little bit more requirements than just the state level. And they've actually adopted our design standards as an additional incentive to kind of make sure that more developments have either, universal design elements or have more cross disability, better, design for people with disabilities that our design standards offer. And then also the city of San Antonio is also doing some great work around it. They kind of have their own kind of set of universal design standards, and any home that's constructed with their finance assistance has to have those involved in it. And so it's definitely, like Ali said, a question of both combining incentives with requirements. And a lot of cities across the country are really starting to realize that this gap exists and that they need to do something about it. And so I think, yeah, those three cities are definitely kind of ahead of the field in terms of making sure that accessible design is at the forefront of these new developments.
Thank you, Hunter. Elena, to you, and then members after this, I want to open it up to the members of the subcommittee to ask questions.
So my kind of thoughts are maybe a little bit less specific to housing, just because it's not really my full expertise area. But thinking about the moments before someone moves into a housing situation or after, I think are also these really important moments to think about. So one barrier is when people don't know what to expect, and thinking about how, and I said technology was not the answer, but here too, I'll go against that. I think having really good websites and digital infrastructure so that people know what to expect, and that it's easy to make an application, to get information, to pay your rent, to not have to leave the house, to maybe not have to have a social interaction. For me, that can be a huge barrier to getting really simple tasks done when I'm just feeling like that's something that I'm not able to do in that day. And so I find a lot of the systems and supports that me and other of my disabled friends have to navigate, often the government websites are just so difficult to navigate. It sometimes makes it, I just almost want to give up. And so I think any investment in improving those systems would be really impactful. And additionally, just from the point of environmental psychology, and what I always see as beneficial is that often as interior designers and architects, we build a space, we take beautiful photos, we Photoshop them, we put them on the website, and we say our job is done. But we really need to be doing a lot more post-occupancy evaluation and actually getting feedback and data from the people who are living in the actual spaces that have been designed. And so that we can actually say, like, what of these grand visions actually worked? What are the ways that we designed something really beautiful and then people had to adapt it anyways because the vision of how we wanted them to use it didn't align with how they actually planned to use it? So I think more post-occupancy evaluation and easier access pre-moving in would be hugely impactful.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Members of the subcommittee, I will first wait for you to raise your hands. And then, as everyone knows, I will then raise your hand for you. Who wants to jump into this conversation? And feel free to ask a question of the full panel or of individual members and panelists. I'm probably not going to go around the full horn because I want to get multiple questions in, but invite you to ask questions. Who on our subcommittee would like to lean in with some questions? Well, then I will feel free to start calling on you. And Anais and Rochelle, I'm going to warn you that I see you first on the left of my screen. I'm going to invite, Nias, let me bring you into this and invite you to ask a question or just reflect on something that you're taking away from this conversation. Rochelle and then Paul, I'm going to get you guys into the conversation as well.
Yes, man. I feel like I'm at church in some way, but also hearing things that allow me to stretch my perspective. So it's not just preaching to the choir, it's allowing me to expand a lot of the things that I've been reflecting on and have been keeping up at night. For example, Allie, what you said about really, at the beginning in this spectrum, right, I started really wanting regulations and really trying to understand, because I'm an advocate and I have, that lived experience is, constantly where I'm existing, right? So where that evokes that in me. I'm like, there needs to be more, regulation. People need to care as much as I do, which is just not realistic. And it's not, it's not going to bring more people in. It's not going to get that buy-in that we've shared. So I really appreciate that perspective and how we balance the incentive, because truly that is what's going to bring more people to the table and what's going to allow that inventory and that ongoing collaboration between people with and without disabilities to come together. So I really appreciated that perspective. It seemed like I have two questions, I think, and they're still cooking. So my apologies as I'm processing and talking. Tim, you mentioned the gaps between affordable housing, service. If you could remind me what that third thing was and what you feel like the gap is between that affordable housing and service. If you could elaborate a little bit on that. And then my second question is, we talk a lot about the QAP and how that affects back to that incentive and, how things are allocated within that. How do we start bringing those individuals to the table? Do you guys have any suggestions? It sounds like, Hunter, you mentioned having a group of advocates, right? Making this front of mind, but strategically, how would you guys think we could start bringing them into the conversation as well?
And this is why I bring Anais into the conversation. She pushes our thinking. Tim, let me go to you first on that gap question she posed, and then Hunter, let me get you in here on the QAPs.
For sure.
And others who want to jump in.
And hi, Tim. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. So what I was referring to was knowledge gaps between the affordable housing community, the service provision community, right, the PASAs and so forth, and the IDD community at large, right? So the individuals that we're talking about and the caregivers, and anything I say is going to be a vast oversimplification, right?
Yes, fair.
Obviously, it's super complicated, right? But when I was in the affordable housing community, I know that I know about affordable housing, but I don't know very much about how that links with the service provision community. And, if I didn't have a family member in the IDD community, then I probably wouldn't know much about the IDD community either. Just not I don't care. It's just that I didn't really have a reason to know these things, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, the service provision community would really like to see affordable housing and have they do have they do have affordable housing, but that tends to be more like group homes and things like that. And those have their own, financial issues, but they don't know very much about, or they don't have a need necessarily to know very much about like how capital A, as I call it, subsidized affordable housing works.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the, folks in the, caregivers and folks in the IDD community that, as Karen rightly, pointed out, are often overwhelmed with just, the activities of daily living, let alone, trying to find out how affordable housing works, right? And so, they might believe that, I always say this as a joke, but they think you got to have a bake sale and raise, and find, $10 million, $20 million in donations in order to build affordable housing. That's not necessarily the case. Helps, believe me, it helps.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily the case. There's a way for all of these systems to work together to everybody's benefit. So, Anais, I hope that answers your question, but that's what I was talking about.
Thanks, Tim. Hunter, your thoughts on the QAPs and how to get a real engaged conversation on that topic and who needs to be there.
Yeah, so our biggest QAP campaign to date has really been in Alabama. So we started working in that community after a parent advocate reached out to us and was really talking about how much the need is there, really in the South in general, but in particular in Alabama and in Birmingham. And so we started, looking at what are the market conditions involved in Birmingham and in Alabama writ large, what kind of advocates on the ground are already doing this particular type of work. And so as a result of that, we formed a working group that is still going really strong. And we focused a lot initially on, the housing market conditions. And then we started looking at what are some of the key programs we can implement, things like Section 811, which, increase the capacity for developments to have, more reduced rent for people with disabilities. And then also what is involved in the qualified allocation plan, like who are the key players that we really need to influence in the space, and did a little bit of power mapping around that. And it really is the, housing allocating agency. A lot of them, for example, in Georgia, they kind of release a survey every year. They release they have a survey that's open any time of year and you can just email them. But some agencies like Alabama is a little bit more closed off. Like they don't necessarily want to listen to the public until they have to. They're like mandated to have a public comment period. And so we were just gearing up, for that public comment period to come out. We made sure that advocates on the ground were able to go to the actual in-person hearing. And then we also just made sure that every single member of that working group was submitting their own public comments. We kind of sent them a template. These are our key recommendations around accessible design, incentives, things like that. And then also just talk to the grassroots advocates on the ground, and see if they knew any other organizations that might be involved or interested in getting involved. So it's really a question of just building relationships with key allies in the state, and really building up your forces that way, and then making sure that you're ready when that yearly qualified allocation plan drops to submit a really robust public comment, because like I said, most of the time they're not used to hearing advocates. They're used to hearing developers. And so I believe that the qualified allocation plan is for Colorado is being drafted currently. And so I think it's a really good time right now to start, influencing key players and educating them on how important this process really is, and then getting them to make sure that they submit comments when the period is finally open, likely towards the end of next month.
Great. That's great.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Anais. And I would love to go around the panel. Realistically, I've got about 12 minutes. It doesn't look like I've got public comment, so I'm going to keep going. Members of the subcommittee, is there anyone who wants to volunteer before being voluntold? Rochelle, I see your hand up and I appreciate that. Jump in, my friend.
Since I thought I was getting called on next, I started prepping. I agree and am very enthusiastic about everything that Anais said. Thank you so much for already asking the question on QAP and how we could maybe look at that. I will have the 9 SIL directors in the state of Colorado be ready to jump in on that QAP comment period. So thank you so much for that. We are just at the end and we are in the comment period for the state plan for independent living right now. And we wrote into that plan one of the top goals of being the assistance of housing and affordable, accessible housing for people with disabilities in the state, and for the state plan to support that. But we have not really carved out the ways that we will do that over the next 3 to 5 years. And so my question to the panel is there any best practices that you are seeing in other states? I know that Colorado's pretty ahead of the game on our SIL network and I hate to toot our own horn, but we know that. But I do want us to be really looking at fantastic models of other states and their plans and how they've incorporated those. And with that, the sub question I have is, I am a big advocate of all of the wraparound services and support services being very much supported almost before the accessible housing is supported, because we know as Centers for Independent Living, our increase in services for housing, it has been about 800% over the last 5 years. And we know that people are not successful with living independently without wraparound services and support systems for benefits enrollment, coordinators, and all of the like. Is there any other models that show really strong wraparound service incentives with those QAPs or with something else in order to make that a priority? Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Who wants to jump in on this one?
Right, I can take.
Let's get Tim and then Allie in, because Allie, I saw you leaning in as well, so I'll get you both in.
So as far as an example of affordable housing and wraparound services and how they interact, the example that's sometimes pointed to is what's been going on with permanent supportive housing for the last decade, call it. And the permanent supportive housing, for those who aren't familiar with it, is really housing that is designed to meet the most acute homelessness needs, right? And so it's permanent supportive housing. So it's housing that is permanent for folks, and so it's not transitional, and it's not a shelter or anything like that, but it comes with wraparound services. So the housing, which is built by housing developers, is connected with a service provider that is going to be providing those wraparound services to the tenants. Now, again, that's an oversimplification. There's some disconnects between permanent supportive housing and how that might work, say, with the IDD community, having to do with, settings rules and so on and so forth. But as an example of like, how do you make housing work for folks who might not be able to stay in that housing, but for the wraparound services, I always point to permanent supportive housing is really the model for that, which is really coming out of the permanent supportive housing really came out of the housing first model of, right, like before you can, before somebody can get themselves together and get their lives together, first thing they have to do is have a roof over their head, right? And so this is, this is the example that it comes from. So I always think it's instructive. It's not, it's no panacea, and it's nothing that will, solve all the problems, but it is instructive in terms of how you connect those services with the actual housing.
Thanks, Tim. Allie, did you have thoughts on this?
I just want to say I'm really glad that you prioritized housing in your state plan. And, as we've already spoken to today, like we need more funding for the housing and like the operations, but we also need a part of the Kelsey's going to be developing kind of a resident services policy agenda. And I think, again, that's kind of like the coordination and the concierge that can be inside a building to support people to self-direct or have community-driven support from in their own unit. But I think, Rochelle, I think that there's so much I don't know. So my answer to your question directly is I don't know if there are other states that have translated kind of their state plan to what happens on the ground. But what I can tell you is that service partners like Centers for Independent Living are critical to ensuring that like the referrals and are just critical partners to disability forward housers. And so how do we also ensure that organizations like yours are funded more robustly to provide those services? And I think that, there is a lot of innovations that is happening around Medicaid housing related services. And so that's something to explore here in Colorado, and what can be what can be driven by kind of a partnership across the state housing agencies and the Medicaid agency. And so I'll pause there, but I think there's definitely some recommendations that you all can maybe put forth in regards to such coordination and making sure that that referral and streamlining happens. Again, so that folks who are outside of kind of some of the more mainstream systems don't fall through the cracks.
Thank you. But Karen, did you want to weigh in?
I'm not the money person. I'm kind of that ideas girl, but I always correlate back to seniors and how senior communities work. You know, what do seniors do when they're on Medicare? You know, we went up to a community up in Loveland that was married into a community up there. And they share the conference room, they share the social hall, the social space. So the services that seniors get could be used by people with low income, VAs. It's not just the IDD community. Some of these services, it's kind of like 3 tiers. There's the building, there's the individual services, who will help my daughter out of the house, and then there's the community piece. So to me, it's looking at 3 different partnerships. That was my thought.
Thank you, Karen. Shelley, I think I saw your hand up. Let me bring you into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Barrick. And let me just say a huge thanks to our panelists who provided a lot of great insights and overview on as we think about this work. My question to you, so Mercy Housing, as you all know, we're a developer, and we've had some experience recently working with the Kelsey, which we're really excited about. What I would really be interested in hearing from the panelists is, can you just speak to, so our experience in developing that, you have the design, the architect design, and then you actually develop the building, but the other leg to the stool is working with municipalities and cities that do the code, that manage the process for code requirements and their understanding and their having the ability to really bring the knowledge and expertise to meet code requirements. Are any of you experiencing any challenges in any of the communities with that?
I will open it up to the panel if anyone wants to respond to any challenges you've encountered on those fronts.
Well, I'll say that so we've mentioned our design standards a few times. The Kelsey put out a set of inclusive design standards that are specific elements that anyone can incorporate into a project to make it more accessible. And it speaks to accessibility, access needs along different fronts: mobility, vision, hearing, cognitive access. There's a number of different access needs that different elements address. And we consider that a layer on top of code. So there's we think of ADA and what's required is like the floor where you start from, and we want to go above and beyond that. So the idea is the standards are something you can do that ideally would become more normal and be worked in, but it's not going against anything that's in the code so much as layering on top of it and taking it further. So, code requires a certain number of mobility units. We say, let's do more than that. And I think the pushback we've seen is more often along the lines of comes from the funding side of like, what's that going to cost? So we sort of have built into our models the cost to build X number of ADA units, and if you're going to build more, isn't that going to be more expensive? That's more the pushback we get, and rather than from a compliance perspective. Yeah, I'll pause there in case anyone else.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I would also be curious, what I'm hearing from development community is sometimes because there's not that expertise at a city level or at a municipality level, that it's creating, creates delays in getting the development to a CO. And, you know, time is money, and it is challenging. And so I'd just be interested to hear if you're seeing, you know, I think cost is one. So Louisa, thank you for calling that out, because whatever it is that we look at as a committee, we have to be mindful that there's going to be a cost. But what else does that create as far as delays? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but we have to look at all of the systems that have a role in the development process to ensure that everybody's up to speed and that we've got the right process and procedure. So no, we're not unintentionally creating additional barriers to develop housing. And sometimes that could happen. So I'm just curious if there's any other thoughts around experience with delays or just the knowledge level at a city or municipality around some of the requirements when we talk about accessible housing or requirements.
Thank you, Shelley. I'm going to see if there's anyone. I am going to ask. We probably got about 2 minutes for answer or answers here. Does anybody want to lean in on those experiences?
So this is David. I will say that, and this isn't housing, but it's the same inspectors. So we redeveloped our office. We remodeled it to make it it wasn't accessible. Well, we were a Medicaid agency. We're required under the Rehab Act to make sure that we had accessibility built in. And the inspectors didn't understand accessibility code at all. They just pulled it out of their back pocket of, oh, well, you got to do this instead of following the guidelines. So it depends on both the planning office at a city level and then also the inspectors, because the inspector knowledge is one of the biggest barriers for getting that accessibility in there, because they have one idea of what it is and it's not necessarily what the regulations say and what's best practice.
Thank you, David. Did I see members of our panel that wanted to lean in on that as well? Allie?
I'll just mention briefly that we have seen that there is a lack of building code alignment. And so, local officials either at different localities and at the state level can ensure that different levels of building code are in greater alignment with the federal codes or the given state code, and a lack of coordination between codes can result in delays and can deter the production of new or rehabbed accessible homes. But more importantly, can result in poor design outcomes for disabled residents. Codes should strive to be more performance-based or have functional design criteria to meet fundamental, purpose of accessibility requirements, rather than kind of what we see, which is when things are misaligned, then actually it creates less functional spaces. It's very nitty-gritty, but it does end up really having its implications. And I'll also just say, what type of education around accessible design and code are, cities across the municipalities across the state of Colorado, what are they required to be educated in, by how often, also, are there ways to engage key universities or pipelines where, these folks come from to embed more disability forward educational materials. There's very few universities across the country that actually really emphasize accessible design. So Colorado could lead even more. Maybe Elena could help lead that with your work. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Shelley, for the question and everyone for the answers. We are unfortunately at 3 minutes to the end. I did take us about, I blew up the whole agenda. Who are we kidding? We had such a fantastic panel that I was not going to let this conversation get stopped. I want to sincerely thank all of our panelists. I will also very transparently ask if we can continue to reach out to all of you as we have follow-up questions. We greatly appreciate your insights and expertise. Members of the subcommittee, I'm going to have two asks for all of you. Number one, I'm going to ask, we're sitting here on Wednesday afternoon. If I could ask members of the subcommittee between now and the end of the day Friday to take 10 minutes and jot down, however rough or in bullet form, your 2 or 3 big takeaways from today. Anything new this led you to be thinking about that you want us to discuss? We're getting ready to really shift into our solution development mode. So I would love if you would take 10 minutes, write down what ideas this either sparked for you or you took away. Shoot those over to Carrie and me in an email. They don't need to be polished. We would just love to start capturing all of that. On that note of time to start developing solutions, Carrie has sent out some surveys. She's probably going to send them out again to nudge everyone. There is a simple reality that we have a limited amount of time to do some really complex work and develop ideas. We are probably going to need some extra meetings. We also have had members ask about the possibility of some extended deep dive time together, whether that's virtual or in person. So Carrie's got some email survey questions about that. I would ask you to respond to those. Finally, just so everyone has expectations of where we now go, we are working to develop our recommendations and submit them to the task force. We're statutorily required to do so by December 1st. I think most folks that have been in the legislative world understand bills start getting pulled way before December 1st. So my goal is to start at least surfacing what the meat of those ideas is going to be sooner than that. Our process for that is that each meeting this summer, we are going to go deep into one of our charges, whether that's understanding the current demand and inventory, whether that's looking at the future demand, whether that's looking at finance. And at each of those meetings, we're going to ask the group to spend the time surfacing what may be 3, maybe 8 different possible ideas of solutions. And it's not going to be to the level of these are our recommendations, but to really come to some general consensus around these are ideas that we think are worth digging more into. And then we're going to use that opportunity to go really stakeholder and socialize those. So it may be that 1 month you surface ideas of some financing mechanisms and we go socialize those to as many stakeholders as we can. And I will tell you, we're not going to ask, do you like or dislike? We're going to ask things like, what do you see as the strengths of these? What concerns or considerations? What would be the implications? So that we can bring that broad stakeholder input back to all of you and work to refine those. And to our panelists, that's the type of place where we'd love to collaborate with you again as this group develops these possible ideas to go socialize them and help us get as many responses and as much diverse input as possible. So that will be our work over the summer. My ask is that you respond, if you haven't, to those surveys Carrie has, that between now and Friday, you write down some of your takeaways or ideas that you're thinking about coming out of today. And that this summer, we all get ready to dig our time, our thinking into developing those solutions. Rochelle, your hand is up. Jump in.
Dang, sorry about that. Just trying to clarify, Friday tomorrow, all of our ideas, or Friday next?
Friday, 2 days from now.
Is today Wednesday?
Today's Wednesday.
Oh, it is, isn't it? All right.
I don't want anybody to think of this as extensive homework. Really, think of it as 3 tweets to me of 140 characters. Just here's what I took away or some ideas that this generated for me. And Rochelle, the reason I'm asking for it this week, I want to capture while it's still hot in your mind. Thank you to our panelists. As I say every month, I am continually moved and humbled by the work of this subcommittee, how many people are donating their time to this work. I'm grateful for all of you. We feel blessed to be able to support this work. Thank you for your time, and we will be in touch by email, and we will see you again next month. Thank you all. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. This was amazing. Thanks.